The central theme of Seneca's tragedies, writes Dana Gioia, is how to endure a world in which there is no justice, no safety, no guarantees, political or divine, of human dignity. Dana Gioia on the dark genius of Seneca and the madness of Hercules, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Dana Gioia is an internationally recognized poet, critic, and former poet laureate of California. He is the author of 6 collections of verse, including Interrogations at Noon, which won the American Book Award, and 99 poems, new and selected, which was awarded the Poets Prize. His critical collections include Can Poetry Matter?, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Award, and The Catholic Writer Today and Other Essays, whose title essay started an international debate about the role of faith in contemporary literature. Dana has written 4 opera libretti and edited over 20 anthologies. For 6 years, he served as chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. Gioia has been awarded 11 honorary doctorates. He has also received the Literaire Medal from Notre Dame, Aiken Taylor Award in Modern Poetry, and the Presidential Citizens Medal. Gioia served as the Judge Whitney Professor of Poetry and Public Culture at the University of Southern California, where he hosted the first Catholic Literary Imagination Conference in 2015. He lives in California. Dana Gioia, welcome.
Good to be here.
Segment 1. Who was Seneca? In the year 1543, the Italian playwright and critic Giambattisa Giraldi Cinthio argued that, quote, in almost all of Seneca's tragedies, he surpassed, in as far as I can judge, all the Greeks who ever wrote, in wisdom, in gravity, in decorum, in majesty, and in memorable aphorism, close quote. And yet for over a millennia, and even today, other than certain enduring pithy observations, Seneca has been considered an irrelevant footnote. Dana, who in fact was Lucius Annaeus Seneca?
Well, Seneca is one of the greatest Roman thinkers, and he has a unique career, really, in classical literature. He was a philosopher, he was a tragedian, and he was one of the major political figures in Rome. He was essentially the prime minister of Rome during the early, well-behaved days of the Emperor Nero. Seneca we associate with a philosophy called Stoicism, and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius are the 2 great Roman Stoics. Now, what Stoicism means is a philosophy which basically looks at how little control people have on their own lives. And it just starts with something very simple. We're all going to die.
Yeah.
We're at the mercy of politics, health, weather, fortune, etc., etc. And how in a world where none of these things are guaranteed, do you lead a meaningful and virtuous life? I think of Seneca and Stoicism, in the words of one commentator, as the threshold to Christianity. Seneca articulates exactly, I think, what the human condition is if we did not have Christ's redemption, if there were not a way, in a sense, of us being redeemed from the fallen human condition. For this reason, Seneca was one of the pagan philosophers that Christians felt a deep kinship with. And I would go back to something, I think a lot of Catholics don't realize this, but there are 2 kinds of revelation. Christianity is a revealed religion. The first is what we think of as the revelation of Scripture, our accounts of the Old and New Testament. But creation itself is a revelation. So we see, we understand God, and we understand God's plan through Scripture and through nature. And so when the early church fathers, were looking at the classical tradition, because they were all educated in this pagan classical tradition,
Sure.
They were trying to say, what do we save and what don't we save? And they felt that there were some pagan writers who, in a sense, were able to discern many aspects of God's plan from natural wisdom, even though they lacked supernatural wisdom. And Seneca was one of these people. Interestingly, Seneca was probably born more or less the same time as Jesus. On the other end of the Roman Empire, he was born in Spain of a very influential, not a rich family, but a very influential family. His father was the greatest rhetorician in Rome, which is sort of like being the greatest trial lawyer, I guess. And each of Seneca and his two brothers all became, very influential Romans. Christians who read scripture know about Seneca's family because Seneca's brother was the Roman magistrate who presided over the trial of St. Paul in Greece. When he was accused, in a sense, of, by the Jewish community of being heretical, and they demanded a death penalty. And Seneca's brother, Junius Gallo, basically declared that St. Paul was innocent. So there is a legend which St. Paul and Seneca knew each other. They certainly knew each other's families. And so it was he is a pagan philosopher who early Christians, St. Jerome, St. Augustine, and others read and preserved, because they felt that Stoicism, which talks about moral discipline, it talks about controlling your human appetites, it talks about, in a sense, focusing, no matter what your troubles are, on basically what you see as a divine plan, was very consonant with Christianity. Sorry to be so long-winded, Todd. I hope that helps.
No, this is wonderful. This is wonderful. What you made me think of too is, I recall reading something from Saint Basil. He was approached. You, I'm sure, familiar with this, but he was approached by some of his, proteges, and they were asking, as young Christians, should they be reading the pagan philosophers or should they not, lest they get corrupted, outside of the kind of the Christian writers and so on and so forth. And I don't know that Saint Basil was referring to Seneca. Time wise, I presume he was not. But I remember Saint Basil had basically said to them, or written, that effectively they should be like the bumblebee that alights upon one flower and takes only the nectar that is needed and leaves the rest behind. The point being that there are incredible bits of wisdom that can be understood by pagan philosophers that predate the Christian narrative, if you will, or the Christian story, and yet still can have an understanding, as you've mentioned, as revealed through man's nature, as revealed through creation, of certain truths of God's creation and the existence of human beings. So that notion of how does someone like Seneca fit into the philosophy and the wisdom that can be used by Christians, it seemed to kind of speak a little bit to that. The second thing I wanted to say is, you're having touched upon kind of the familial, the honors that were bestowed upon Seneca the elder. I wanted to see if you could say it's striking that Seneca could be kind of a forgotten figure, because he had probably more political clout than almost any poet or writer of his time, and he was connected to his father Seneca the elder and his nephew Lucan. Can you just say a few words about those two, Seneca the elder and Lucan, as part of this family tradition of whatever excellence and intelligence and so on, and then maybe speak a little bit about Seneca's relationship with the young and soon-to-be Emperor Nero?
Yeah, well, Seneca, see, one of the things you should remember about Seneca and every other Roman was that no matter how rich, how powerful you were, you might at any moment be arrested, tortured, and killed.
Good point.
you might that there was no way to protect your life. I mean, when the American forefathers created the American Republic, they modeled it after Rome, but they added the Bill of Rights. Because they saw what happens to a republic that becomes a tyranny.
Yes.
But Seneca was from this fabulously talented family. His father, rhetoric, was probably, I don't know, a great rhetorician was sort of like being the head of Harvard Law School and the MIT physics faculty. I mean, it was the most prestigious intellectual position you could have, and that was Seneca's father in Rome. And rhetoricians taught that, if people wanted to be able to argue and explain their case, because that was a preservation strategy in ancient Rome, be able to do this. And he also argued legal cases, and he also would have argued in government. So he has these various sons. Seneca is very sickly. And that's actually what keeps him from being killed a few times, is that he's so sick, the Caligula wants to kill him after he's argued a case. They said, don't worry, Seneca's going to be dead in a year anyway.
Wow.
But Seneca's, each of Seneca's brothers, one ends up running the finances for the Roman Empire. Junius Galla, the one that, sort of freed St. Paul, is a, major Roman, governor. I mean, he was ruling Greece on behalf of the Roman Empire. Seneca's nephew is a poet that's not much read now, named Lucan, Lucanus. Those of your listeners who have read Dante's Inferno, if you remember this, Dante is being led through half of the afterlife by a virtuous pagan, namely Virgil. And Virgil, was declared by Christians as having anima naturalitar Christiana, a naturally Christian soul, not a supernaturally Christian soul, but it was believed that God, as it were, blessed certain, virtuous pagans by giving them a kind of natural insight to the way a Christian would have. So, and Dante, looks to Virgil as the preeminent one of these. So they're going through before they go to the punishment, there's a part of hell called the Elysian Fields, which is a natural landscape in which virtuous pagans are allowed to live in the afterlife. So, they are given, as it were, a version of their own world, of the natural world, not the supernatural world that Dante will discover. And as he's walking through there with Virgil, Dante's noticing these people, and one of the people he notices almost right away is Seneca. Seneca Morava, he calls him, which is to differentiate him from Seneca's father, just if they have the same name. And then they are greeted by the four greatest poets of antiquity: Homer, Ovid, Horace, and Lucan. So Dante would have said that Lucan, who was this young nephew of Seneca, was really was one of the three greatest of all Roman poets. What happened, was that, so they were, all of them were, very influential because they were so capable, so smart. Seneca kept going in exile, he was in exile under Caligula. He was in exile under Claudius. But towards the end of Claudius's life, when he married a very ambitious woman named Agrippina, she convinced Claudius to adopt her son. And this is the young man who becomes Nero. And she wanted to give her son a respectability, so she recalled Seneca, who was living, I think at that point, in Corsica, which is, I don't know, kind of like living in Siberia for a Roman. Back to Rome to be Nero's tutor. And so, Seneca took this young man and basically was his private tutor. And when he it was it would take an hour to explain how
Yeah,
messy,
yeah.
murderous, and vile Roman politics were. But eventually, Agrippina kills her husband, the Emperor Claudius, and then which means that Nero becomes the emperor. But in effect, the young Nero is ruled by his mother, by Seneca, who becomes kind of the political prime minister, and an practical old general named Burrus, who does the military. And this is a period of about, I think, 7 years, which later Roman historians say is the best governed span in the entire history of the Roman Empire.
Wow.
Better even than the empire under Augustus. But as we all know, as Nero gets older, and he gets more wayward, he becomes a particularly nasty character. He eventually murders his own mother. Probably the most dramatic episode of matricide.
Yeah.
He creates a pleasure yacht for her, and she goes out on it, but it's designed so that the poop of it falls down to crush her. She escapes. She jumps in the water. These soldiers try to beat her to death with things, but she pulls them up and she gives this couple name. She kills the people trying to kill her. She gets to shore and sends her son, whom by this point she realizes what's going on, a note saying, "Your mother is safe." Which is not what Nero wanted to hear.
Yeah.
And Nero then pulls in Burrus and Seneca and explains to him what he's done. And they have no idea. They realize that they're about to have a civil war. And civil war, if you think of the American Civil War, more Americans were killed in the Civil War than the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Civil wars are tremendously murderous. And Romans, between Caesar and Nero, there's been several absolutely destructive civil wars. And Seneca and Burrus, I think, understand that a civil war is about to happen between these things, and so they just look the other way. And when Nero sends another team of assassins and kills his mother, but but at this point Nero's out of control, and Seneca and Burrus are sort of half controlling him. Then Burrus dies, and Seneca realizes it's hopeless. So Seneca and by this point, Seneca is one of the richest people in the Roman Empire. He gives all of his possessions to Nero, and he retires to the country. And this is when Nero really goes nuts. I mean, most of the things of the big excesses of Nero is when he's there with no adult supervision.
Yeah.
But eventually, there's a conspiracy to kill Nero. He discovers it at the last moment, and Lucan who was a 26-year-old poet who's already famous, seems to be part of it. So, basically as a precaution or as a vengeance, Nero decides to kill everyone in Seneca's family, and so they're all wiped out, as well as this other great writer named Petronius, who is the author of the Satyricon, who's the court. So in a matter of a couple of days, Nero kills the 3 greatest living Roman authors. And honestly, Roman literature never recovers.
Wow.
So he kills, Seneca, the tragedian and philosopher, Lucan, the great epic poet, and Petronius, who essentially invents the novel in the Western world. So Seneca is at his estate, and he gets a note, if he's out in the country at the farm, essentially, that his death has been ordered. And so what he has to do, because it's in Rome, people often notice that Romans are always killing themselves.
Yeah.
If the authorities were coming to get you, and you were going to be brought to a trial that was just going to be kangaroo court.
Yeah.
Because you knew when you got arrested, whoever was going to do it was going to get you killed. If you managed to kill yourself before the state killed you, you could pass your property on to your family.
Oh, wow.
So a father would see this, and so he would kill himself so that his children did not lose their farm. So Seneca decides to kill himself, and he has, in his imagination, the deaths of Socrates and the deaths of Cato.
Sure.
Both of whom did it, and so he has gives a speech, and then kills himself. It's actually rather hard to kill him because he's an ascetic. He's a tough old bird.
Yeah.
He fasts. He lives a very meager life, and so they have to. It takes a long time for him to die. But he's surrounded by his students, and he basically says, that it's not surprising that a man who would kill his mother would then kill his tutor.
Yeah.
It goes on. So he dies in the grand style, surrounded by people, and his suicide is one of the most famous death speeches in classical literature.
It's incredible. It's incredible. Again, the way you unfolded the drama of this it's captivating. Dana, in your opening, several of your opening reflections in Seneca, The Madness of Hercules, you've written this. You said Seneca was the first great Latin writer to spend his adult life in a totalitarian age. He had no memory of the Republic. The golden age of Augustus had ended during his adolescence. Seneca's Rome was the autocracy of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, where political power superseded law, morality, and tradition. And so I wanted to ask you, and again, you've unfolded that just in grand style there. How do you, and I know you can't divine to be in Seneca's mind, but how did this existence in kind of this totalitarian age, how do you sense that molded Seneca's worldview and his plays?
Well, absolutely. I think it was the precondition. I mean, Seneca is above all a practical and realistic thinker. Mm-hmm. Plato is talking about there's a whole other realm of existence, which is ideal, in which the things that we see in imperfect version in this dimension, exist, in this empyrean. Seneca had no such consolations. Mm. The Stoics were about, how do you put it? They were brutally realistic without letting that make them moral brutes. Yeah. So the whole challenge of Stoicism, and you can see this is very much in a book that I've been rereading lately. I love it. My wife doesn't find it as fascinating as I do. Is de Caussade's Abandonment to Divine Providence.
Oh, yeah.
I just and it's, if you look at Stoicism, it's a very, very Catholic in that it's he's like the big version of Saint Teresa's Little Way, which is that you can't control time, fate, death, disease, political misfortune. So you focus on all of those things that you can control and make even the smallest gestures of your life reflect your philosophy. Mm. One of my favorite, I have, in this one book I've done, I have all these sayings by Seneca. One of them is, that, no man is free who is a slave to his body. Mm. Another one is every life is too short. We're all going to have death, and so you have to take everything that you're given and use it well. Because he says it's not that we have too little time, it's that we waste too much of it. Mm. And so, it's about, and for me as a Catholic, and, I think some people will share this. One of the turning points for me was the notion that I live in the present moment, accepting the grace of, open to the grace of God, and trying to live in harmony with divine providence, and not worry about gigantic things, but to worry about the moment that I was in, the person I'm talking to, the thing that I'm doing, and it's liberating.
Yes.
And I found enormous grace in that, and I think that's what the Stoics do, or at least Seneca does, which is that that once you say, look, I'm not going to worry about the things I don't control.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to shape and make meaningful everything that I do. And when you read Seneca's letters, he's really quite jolly. He's talking about, and he's very radical. I mean, this is very Christian too. Somebody writes about slaves, and he says, you have to understand, except for the accidents of fortune, you could be a slave too. You have to treat slaves as people. Now, he's not arguing. He knows that he can't abolish the institution of slavery, which is the fundamental economic principle in the ancient world. People forget this, but slavery was the capital, of the ancient world.
Sure.
But what you can do is make every interaction with slaves done in such a way which acknowledges their humanity. That except for their circumstances, they're equal to you. That's a radical notion in ancient Rome. But there's 100 other things like this. And the other thing is, and the one thing that's kind of, I think it's contemporary Catholic. I think the early church fathers might have disagreed with this. He says, look, you're virtuous, but don't dress in rags and grow a big beard and let your hair so that when you walk down the street, everybody goes, oh, look at that virtuous, humble man. And he has this one phrase that's great. You think of Roman men wore togas. He goes, don't wear too fine or too frowsy a toga. Don't call attention to yourself.
On either way, too ostentatious or too ragged.
Be neat, be clean. The same thing. Don't starve yourself. So people say how virtuous are. Just eat just enough.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of what he's saying is that you find freedom and joy in self-control.
Yeah.
And so that's I think Stoicism is having a huge resurgence among young men right now. So I was surprised by how much when I discovered these things, and a lot of them are young Catholic, young Christian men. Yeah. And it's because they're in a society which, just not news to you, Todd, has, very loose values, if any.
Yeah.
And what they want to embrace meaningful disciplines that lead them, in a sense, to controlling and feeling positive about their lives. And so, so Seneca has a great appeal to these young men.
Segment 2, The Darkness of Lyrical Tragedy. Seneca's tragic vision, Dana Gioia writes, admits no escape from evil, no defense against the mindless brutality of fate. The gods may witness human suffering, but they will do nothing to prevent or soften it. So, referring to Seneca's gruesome masterpiece, Thyestes, Dana says, Seneca has performed the miracle of tragic theater to lure the audience to the edge of an abyss, to watch a fellow human's sudden fall to destruction, to make them feel the injustice and agony of the doomed without ever turning away. Dana, what is it, and you alluded to it a little bit in our last segment, what is it about the darkness of tragedy that is simultaneously alluring as well as repellent? In other words, why can't we just look away?
Well, the human urge is to look away. We see this we're in a terrible situation right now, I think, in terms of international politics. Yeah. With this war going on in the Gaza, in Ukraine, across North Africa. people are massacred, on a daily basis in different places. And the human urge is saying, well, thank God, you and I are safe, so let's just focus on good things. And there's a certain sanity in that. I mean, if you meditate on these dark things all the time, but the fact is that if you are a reflective person, you have to, at some point, focus on the most difficult matters. And let me say something. As Catholics, every time we go to Mass, we're meditating on this.
Yeah.
But with the comfort of it being the source of redemption.
Right.
But in secular life, it's not obvious that any of these things are the source of redemption. Will the current conflict between Israel and the Palestinians lead in redemption for either side? I don't think so. Mm. And so tragedy is, in a strange way, is one of the beginnings of Western literature. And in ancient Greece, they have this theater, this amphitheater, to which the entire city comes. And they act out episodes with what they believe are real episodes from their own history, which are just terrifying, awful things. Mm. And they usually consist of situations in which two parties, both of whom think they are right, meet up, with horrifying consequences. And they act them out. And what Aristotle says is that, because most people go through their lives with anxieties, with fears, with worries, with dark impulses. That they want to hurt people and everything else. What Aristotle felt is that you'd sit there, you'd watch these things, and you purge them. I mean, it's the same
cathartic.
For taking a dump. That you purge these things out of your soul, and the artistry allows you to watch things, and so it goes into a sense of what Christians and what classical thinkers think of as beauty. Beauty is not pretty. Beauty is seeing the shape. You could say the divine shape, the real shape that reality takes. And so what tragedy does is allow you to see the darkest, most violent things that happen to humanity in a way which allows you to make some sense of them. And the way you bear it is that it's beautiful. And so in ancient Athens, they would sing and dance these stories. And that's what opera is based on. In 1599, these Italians in Florence said, let's recreate Greek tragedy, and they ended up creating opera. But it's the same sort of thing. It's a very stylized, musical presentation of these things. And it's the beauty of operatic music that allows us to watch all of these people die on stage. And what it does, and I think it's very simple. I mean, I think opera is a very good, if you look at opera and you see somebody like Mimi in La Bohème dying, she's a poor girl with tuberculosis, there's no cure. Or Violetta dying, she dies of tuberculosis. A lot of people die of tuberculosis.
Yeah.
And, or, people, what it does is you suddenly experience their lives from the inside, and you have an empathetic understanding of the suffering of others, and that to me is the beginning of human growth. In terms of moral growth, to recognize the dignity of other people, and so. What you have in Seneca, in the Middle Ages, they thought, in the Renaissance, they thought Seneca was the greatest tragic writer ever. And part of that was because he wrote in Latin, but part of it is because what he does is so beautiful now, and so powerful and so wise. And so the play I did called The Madness, that I translated, called The Madness of Hercules. If you think about it in a big sense, who is the most powerful human being who ever lived? And a Greek or a Roman wouldn't have hesitated. It's Hercules. No man has ever been given this strength, this courage. He's a human. He's half human, but he's even able to defeat the gods. His 12 labors, he defeats 12 different monsters or does 12 different impossible tasks. And so the Madness of Hercules is about how the most powerful human being who ever lived is tricked by his own pride, in a sense, to do things that make him go mad and slaughter his own family. What these tragedies do, they're about the great and powerful people who, through hubris, through their vanity, their pride, make tragic mistakes that cannot be rectified. And so, for Hercules, in Seneca's Hercules, you at the end of this, you realize that he's not better than other people. He's actually, in some cases, this is worse than other people. You realize the powerlessness of these good people who love him, and so it's a cathartic experience to read this play and the others. And Seneca bases his on Euripides' Madness of Hercules, his Hercules. But Seneca does everything that Euripides does, but adds 2 layers of meaning that are fascinating. One is this long speech by the goddess Juno, who to a Roman, which shows that, under the Roman system, under the pagan system, the gods are not good.
Yeah.
The gods are vain, they're selfish, they're vengeful, they're petty. And Seneca was a monotheist. He believed that there was, this one God who was good and who was wise, but was remote from the world, and you understood him through nature. So you can see how somebody like St. Jerome or Augustine saw that in Seneca and said, yeah, that's all you can get through natural wisdom. You need the revelation, you need the incarnation, you need the redemption to go beyond this. But at least Seneca has pushed the natural order to a kind of monotheistic end. Yes. And so there's a whole critique, really, I would say, of basically the pagan polytheism that's in this. And then also, and this is something that people should read The Madness of Hercules to see. Hercules enters when he's rescued the hero Theseus from the underworld. And Theseus gives an account of what it's like to go down to the underworld and what the underworld is like. And Dante just took this wholesale and put it into the Inferno. People always say, well, Dante got it from Homer and Virgil. But when you read this, you'll see that how much Dante got from Seneca.
Wow.
And he acknowledges it by giving Seneca a little cameo.
Yeah, for sure. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, The Madness of Hercules. In Seneca's The Madness of Hercules, recently translated by Dana Gioia and released by Wise Blood Books, the angry goddess Juno spits, "The first act of my madness is a prayer for Hercules. May he return home safe, his strength intact, and find his little sons happy and healthy. Why resent his vigor? I want him strong today. I want the same great force that conquered me to be his conqueror. I crave occasion to applaud this hero who triumphed over death's dominion as he begs for death and grovels for oblivion." So with this new edition, and it's gripping. It's to me, it's like unearthing another. It is kind of unearthing a tragedy. I love reading the Greek tragedies. With the marvelous translation and the incisive introduction by you, Dana. I want you. I want you to move forward into the plot again, because you started in our last segment. I want you to go a little bit further into it, but I want to backtrack for 1 second and say why this play of Seneca's and why now. And after that, I want you to say a little bit about your own background with Latin, because I think you have maybe a story you could pass on to us. But why Seneca's The Madness of Hercules, and why now? Let's start with that.
Well, I think it's one of the greatest Western tragedies. And some years ago, there was Johns Hopkins was going to do new translations of all of Roman drama. And so I told the editor I would either do the Thyestes or Hercules. And he asked me to do Hercules. And that was the first version of this play, which was then put on in a sort of semi-staged production in New York. So I was actually able to see it in front of an audience and to hear it.
Wow.
And that allowed me to revise it in its current form. And I have every line that Seneca wrote. I didn't cut anything, but it took me a long time to make everything work. To find exactly the language. And what really inspired me is who is the most famous student of Seneca? Not Nero, it's Shakespeare. Shakespeare read Seneca as a schoolboy, and that's his start. Hamlet is a Senecan revenge tragedy.
Wow.
To which Shakespeare has added this fabulous sort of Renaissance psychology. It's the eternal lie. But you see this already in Seneca, that these characters have these long monologues these soliloquies in which they reveal their inner lives. So I was fascinated, but I was really fascinated because The Madness of Hercules is a play which T.S. Eliot quotes twice in his important poetry. And then Eliot himself wrote the only really great modern essay on Seneca. He's trying to revive Seneca when Seneca was considered unspeakable. And so I look at my book, which consists of a very long, full-dress defense of Seneca, full-length essay. I look at myself as continuing T.S. Eliot's work.
Wow.
Eliot never translated Seneca. Eliot was not really much of a translator, but I felt that the only way I made this long essay and I make these claims for Seneca, and I felt that I had to demonstrate them in a translation which gave English readers a sense of how good Seneca was. And so I had to do that really, how do I put this? I did it, it's all in modern English. There's no archaisms, I believe, in it.
Yeah.
It can be acted on stage. I saw it acted on stage, and I sharpened it greatly. I believe it's all accurate. God, Seneca's a difficult writer in Latin, by the way. It's not an easy, his prose is really easy. His verse is extremely hard.
Okay.
But I tried to do translate Seneca, acknowledging that he is the godfather of Elizabethan theater. That people like Shakespeare, Marlowe, Webster, they were weaned on Seneca, and the way that they reflected his language, his power, his rhetoric, that I could use elements of that. So I like to think there's a certain Shakespearean energy in a lot of these speeches. I'm not trying to imitate Shakespeare, but trying to get that, the way that, the energy and the force with which he translated language. There's a lot of other little things I could talk about,
but you're putting your finger on it. What's interesting is I love reading Shakespeare. I love the Greek tragedies, and I'm reading this, and I feel like you've sort of, in the kindest way, pointing me towards, hey, if you like those two, jump into this one. And it is a gripping read. It really is. And it's got that tragic turn, of course, that you've been talking about.
Well, put it this way: if you're going, Seneca is not a realistic tragedy. He's a poetic tragedy. He's a verse tragedy. Yeah. If you want to bring, it was sort of like saying, I'm going to do La Traviata by Verdi, but I'm going to cut all the music out.
Yeah.
You'd say, well, what's the fuss about this? So I had to get the music. So the entire play is metrical. The speeches are in blank verse, and the choruses are rhymed in elaborate ways. And so each of the choruses have certain English poems behind them. Because when Seneca's doing that, he's echoing Sophocles or Euripides or Homer, and so I make sure mine have echoes in them. So you have a sense of the choruses speaking not just as people, but almost reflecting a whole tradition. Of thought. So one of them is based on Milton's Lycidas. Now, once again, you don't need to know that to read it, but if you know that, you'll start to see how some of the effects are working. But anyway, I tried to do it. I tried to do it very seriously, and it took me a long time.
It's beautifully done. I mean, and I'm no scholar in this, but to the lay reader who has an enthusiasm for the great works of history, it's outstanding. Dana, out of curiosity, just on a side note, does the full fruition of your work come in when you see this acted out on stage, or would you say, I don't ever have to? I mean, I know you said you've seen it. I think you've seen a version of it which you tweaked or what have you said up on stage. But could you be done writing this, translating this, kind of putting all the considerations of the meter and so on into it, and close that book and sit back in your chair and say, you know what, that is the full fruition? Or is it like, until it's on the stage, I'm not going to be fully satisfied? What's your sense about that?
Well, I had the advantage of having it produced, in an earlier version, so I was able to learn from it. It worked. We had 2 sellout audiences. The audiences loved it, and that felt good too. To feel like it was working, even if I saw little things to sharpen up. It was working.
Yeah.
The thing is that I'm going to be stoic about this. Can I control whether it's being produced or not? No.
Yeah.
So I tried to do the first modern translation of Seneca in English that I think has the full poetic power of the original. Mm-hmm. And I feel pretty good about having kind of done that. I mean, you might say, Dana, you're overestimating it. I won't argue with you.
No, you're not.
An author's vanity, a poet's vanity is endless. But I felt that to get it done, but that's why, I wanted to do a completely revised version. I took, with this very long essay. So I wanted this wise blood book of the madness of Hercules, I feel, is perfect in its way and suffices. Now, having said that, I got an email today from a producer I know at the BBC who is saying, would you be interested in getting it done as a radio drama? And I would. That would be one if that happened, but I'm not good. If it doesn't happen, I'm not going to, drink a cup of hemlock in despair. So I mean, and I'm already at work. I'm trying to finish another book right now. unsuccessfully. The last 2 weeks, I've been 2 paragraphs from finishing it. But as I approach those paragraphs, I keep rewriting everything else. My wife's kicked me out of the house. Crazy. But so anyway. But I think you asked actually a good deeper question. If you're a poet and you're trying to write work, does the recognition matter? Do you have to have somebody applaud in public and things like that? Now, I've been very fortunate. People actually have applauded me in public. It's probably gone to my head, but it really doesn't matter. Years ago, I interviewed the novelist Anthony Burgess, the author of Clockwork Orange, very Catholic writer. Not a shall I say particularly observant Catholic, but totally Catholic. Obsessed with Saint Augustine and the early church. But I was talking to him, and he said, "Well, you're right." I said, "As a poet," and he thought about this, and he himself, he goes, "If you're a poet, you have to remember that you're writing for God." And I thought that was almost the best advice I ever got as a poet.
Yeah.
I don't think he meant that I should be writing devotional poems that that good sisters read to third graders in parochial school. I think what he's saying is that that I was reading Kierkegaard the other day, rereading this thing about you stand as it were naked before God in fear and trembling, which means when I write, God knows if I'm telling the truth, if I'm working so hard, if I'm faking it. I'll have a piece and I'll say, this piece, it'll work. It'll work. If I send it into the Washington Post, they'll publish it. But I'll say it's not good enough, and I'll take the extra day to work just on one sentence or maybe two sentences. And so what I felt Anthony Burgess was saying was that on the last day, when I stand before God, he'll say, "Well, Gioia, you're a pretty pathetic sinner, but by God, you gave your best effort to the poems."
Yeah, good one.
Good or bad, I didn't try to fake it. I didn't lie, and I didn't. There's a wonderful line by W.H. Auden, about the temptation for a poet to wow the crowd with a resonant lie.
Oh, wow.
I can't tell you how often I hear actually non-resonant and resonant lies. People just sort of throw a gesture out because they think people will approve it. So anyway, so that is to answer perhaps the question you didn't ask.
It's very good. It's very good.
But I do think that you're, as a Catholic, my literary vocation is identical with my poetic vocation. And I don't mean that by saying I'm going to just write devotionals, things on religious subjects. It means that I take on this task with the fullness of my being, and I try, in a sense, to embody those virtues that I've been asked to embody. And you have a kind of, it's a simultaneous thing of idealism and humility.
I want to turn back again to the madness of Hercules. So Jupiter's wife, the goddess Juno. By the way, before I go on, I want to say to people who have not really returned to the tragedies out there, and again, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's the Greek tragedians, or now Seneca. If you haven't visited since high school or college, and maybe you didn't have a taste for it back then, all I would say to you is, after maybe an extra decade, 2 or 3 or 4 of experience of the ups and downs of life, and the recognition of some of the truths behind Stoicism, and the need to abandon ourselves in our Catholic faith to divine providence, I would just really implore you to return again. And if you're looking to start someplace, start with the Madness of Hercules, only because I do think, circling back to our original conversation about why we watch the tragic, it is cathartic. It is commiserative, if there's such a word. We commiserate with others in their tragedy. It is galvanizing because, there's a memento mori type of a sense about it, that it makes you kind of concentrate on what really matters in life and quit worrying about the small stuff and focus on the big stuff. So anyway, the Madness of Hercules is very raw. It's gripping. And so I've said that before, but so Jupiter's wife is the goddess Juno, and she feels somewhat spurned by the fact that Jupiter has had a relationship with a human being that begat Hercules, and so Juno has this axe to grind against Hercules, wanting to hurt Hercules as well as hurting Jupiter, who was Zeus, through hurting Hercules. And so the opening soliloquy of this will just draw you right in. It's again a gripping journey through the raging mind of a scorned woman. Determined to destroy Hercules, the heroic product of Jupiter's infidelity, Juno insists, she says, "My only peace will be eternal war." And she calls upon unappeasable guardians of pain, effectively from the depths of hell, the goddesses discord, violence, error, and madness, to assist her in her destruction of Hercules. But she knows that Hercules is nearly invincible, as his conquest, as Dana, you said, of the 12 labors has shown. And so Juno plots, and she says, "But there's one sure way to conquer him. I will make Hercules destroy himself." So this opening salvo of Juno's just drips with vengeance. So Dana, spending so much time with Seneca, not only his writings, but also his history and his background, what is it that Seneca, how does he arouse such gripping emotional reaction in his readers that it seems even Aeschylus or Euripides cannot quite achieve?
Well, he has Seneca, he's the son of the greatest rhetorician in Rome, which means one of the greatest public speakers, one of the greatest writers. He himself is trained in this, and he understands the full possibilities of language. And I think this is one of the things that's distinct, which is Seneca from the Greeks. They're writing public plays that are going to be done with the entire population of Athens, there, and they're going to be sung, they're going to be danced, they're going to be chanted, and so there's a kind of an economy they have, which is extremely powerful, incredibly powerful. And in fact, you can say that the greatest eras of drama are when not just the leader in the theater, but when a mixed audience is in the theater. That's what's true of Shakespeare. It's true of Italian opera. It's true of Greek tragedy. What Seneca is doing is taking tragedy one step closer into the heart of literature. Literature that, and I think his tragedies, in fact, there's some debate as to whether they were acted. I think they were acted because the Romans loved spectacle. But Romans, and it's true of most people before, the modern age, they loved to hear great language. The Lincoln-Douglas debates went on for hours. People were fascinated. And so what Seneca is trying to do is to say, how much can you pack into speech? And so he has these speeches that are I think, longer and more forceful and elaborate than anything in Greek tragedy. The Madness of Hercules begins with a speech by the goddess Juno that takes up the whole first act. It is one of the greatest monologues in European drama. And I saw this when we produced it. This woman came on, and she is angry, vengeful, unscrupulous, and deliciously hypocritical. She goes these things that just when you think she can't be more outrageous, she does a little turn and finds a way. And when she did it, the audience was mesmerized. Now, I knew the critics said, well, nobody likes Seneca because his speeches are so long. Well, yeah, his speeches are so long if they're badly translated. But if you actually, capture, what Seneca does is like he has a great poetic flight, and he just gives you a killer diller line, great maxim. And in fact, I like this actress so much that I had 2 public appearances, and I said, I'd like you to come along and I'll read some poems. I want you to recite your whole monologue. I'm going to read some poems. And whenever I did it, she was fantastic. She stole the show. But I learned something. Afterwards, these women would come up and say, I love that poem. She's so right. That's what men are like. That's what women are like. And I realized that, on its own, what Seneca is giving you with Juno is essentially unqualified egotism, which therefore becomes unqualified evil. And it's very attractive to people. Now, he puts it in a context, which shows this. But the theme of the madness of Hercules, I mean, I talked about Hercules as the most powerful person who ever lived, but the real theme is that you cannot go into evil. You can't descend into the underworld. You can't let loose vengeance or anything like this without becoming weakened and polluted by it. And and you see this too. I mean, at the very end of Juno's speech, she's there's in the Greek system, there's the gods, and there's these older kind of gods, these kind of supernatural forces. At the very end, she's calling up all of these supernatural forces, all these demons and furies from hell, and and you can see that they've polluted her just as they will pollute and destroy Hercules. And the reason that they can take over Hercules is because he's gone down into the underworld, in which he's violated these sacred places. The world of the dead is not open to the living. And so he's and so I think this is a very important message for today. You can't dwell in kind of immoral things, and then just walk away and say, I'm going to be okay. Now, I know as Christians, we believe that God will forgive you, but the fact is that you'll have weakened moral aspects about yourself, and that you have to be careful about what you do, and so I think that that's really there, which is that you don't play with dark and demonic forces, and it's vivid, and the consequence of this is that Hercules kills everyone he loves, and essentially dooms himself to a shameful existence just at the moment of his greatest triumph. When a classical tragedy usually takes place in the course of one day. So this is the day in which Hercules completes his 12th and final labor, which frees him from this contract he has with this king, makes him a free man where he can return to his family. And as a consequence, at least Juno believes, Jupiter will make him into a god. So it's his moment of greatest triumph. But, his pride and his reckless behavior, matched with basically the evil rancor of Juno, who's been trying to kill him ever since he was a baby, will doom him. So I think there's a significant moral weight. It's very complicated. It's not complicated. You can read it and you can follow it all the way through. But when you put all the pieces together, it's a very complicated.
In everything you've said there, and in reading this, once again, it reminds a lot of the Catholic narrative, which obviously was not part of Seneca's worldview. But that notion of, again, conquest, of rising above the external forces in your life and achieving great things and making a name for yourself and being swamped with honor and power, what is it? Power, honor, pleasure, wealth, the things that serve as surrogates for God, that in the end, Hercules could come literally back from the dead, from the underworld, and ultimately be destroyed. And like you said, his moment of greatest glory be destroyed ultimately by pride, by his hubris, and by himself. And so that's the interesting thing at the very beginning, where Juno is like, how do you defeat the invincible person? Well, in the end, you do what he doesn't expect is you turn him on himself. And how do you turn him on himself? Well, you make him tainted by, like you said, some of the dabbling he's done with all these dark things. And secondly, make him somewhat surrender to his pride. And so it's amazing that you could have someone, an ancient Roman writer, speak to those things. We can say, I get that. I understand that as a Catholic. I understand my shortcomings with evil, my shortcomings with pride and hubris, and my own downfall, and anger. Yeah.
And anger. Both Juno and Hercules believe that it's virtuous to indulge your anger, versus something, So anyway, it's a very, Dante calls him Seneca morale, Seneca the moralist.
Segment 4: Why Seneca Matters. Aeschylus wrote more than 90 plays, Dana Gioia muses. Sophocles produced at least 110. Only 7 tragedies by each dramatist has survived. No one knows how many plays Seneca wrote, but posterity possesses 10 tragedies linked to his name. So, Dana, late at night, with your glee-filled eyes staring at the ceiling, is there any part of you praying that an ancient bookcase stuffed with lost Greek and Roman masterworks will be unearthed on some remote archaeological dig?
Well, they exist now. We have all of these curled up papyri from Pompeii or from Herculaneum, but they don't know, they can't unravel them without disintegrating. And so they're developing this complicated and fascinating technology where they feel that they can, X-ray through them and things like that. So there is a possibility that, while we're still around today, that through, all kinds of technology, including artificial intelligence, they'll be able, figure you had like 100 alphabetic letters put on top of each other as you're going through, looking through a rolled up, going on top of each other and not necessarily perfectly aligned, that they might be able to do this. So I'm hoping that it happens. And actually, in our lifetime, they have found there was a Greek comedy that had been lost, a satyr play that had been lost, and most recently a couple of poems by Sappho. Now, the interesting thing about the Sappho is that modern. I talk a little bit about this in my introduction. The modern classical scholars basically are just skeptics. They'll say, this is everything that every book has been discovered, every book's been edited, every book's been annotated. All they can do is cast aspersions on the authenticity of things. So they say Homer didn't write Homer, this, that, And so with Sappho, they go, there's this legend that she did this, there's this legend that she did this. And how do we know this? This guy lived like 200 years after her. It's just a legend and everything else. And so they found these poems, and in every case, they validated one of the things that scholars had rejected. He had a brother that lived this name, he lived in this place. I think he imported wine and all. And it was quite funny because what it says is that tradition is actually much more valid than these skeptics think.
Good one.
And so anyway, I hope it would be nice if some of the because you can make a long list of very famous books that works that we know existed, but nothing survives. The poet Ovid wrote a tragedy of Medea. Julius Caesar composed a tragedy of Oedipus. But that would be interesting. It's a very good play, but it would be interesting to read. But Roman drama existed for about, through almost 4 centuries. And the only things that have survived are the comedies of Plautus and Terence and the tragedies of Seneca. So you've got about, more, than 30 plays, actually about 20, a little over 20 plays. Shakespeare's comedies come out of Protestant Terence, and his idea of tragedy comes out of Seneca. So and that's not just true of, this is true of in all of the Romance languages too. Racine, Corneille, Lope de Vega, these are all originate in Seneca. People forget this. Cervantes wrote a Seneca tragedy. And so, it would be interesting if we could amplify this with seeing what a couple of other Roman plays would be like. But I guess we could have to see what Ovid's Medea was. I imagine it was a pretty good play.
So, but what I'm curious about is this. I mean, this is what's so confusing to me. So, you have Seneca in this position of immense political power. You have Seneca from this incredibly celebrated, talented family. You have Seneca who writes these extraordinary tragedies and other works, and yet no one. How could he be forgotten? And you'd said one of your lines was, "No Roman genre has suffered more consistent disparagement than tragedy." You'd mentioned that in the writings. What's the deal?
I'll tell you exactly how it happened, and I know I'm right. I don't know if anybody will agree with me. As Germany emerged, in Germany is a great and smart, group of people. As they started emerging in the 18th century, they were at that point largely Protestant. They viewed themselves against the Roman Church, against these Latin powers like France and Italy, and they also began to develop a philosophy that they, a lot of times when you make a philosophical, how do I put it? A new philosophical theory, it may have more to do with you than the people you're talking about. But in the 18th century, they began to say, look, there's two kinds. There's the great writers are these people that are like in sync with nature. And that when Homer wrote as an author, but he wrote in such a way that every Greek could read him and say that this was exactly the way that he was doing, because he was in tune with nature. But the Romans weren't really in commune with nature. They just wrote imitations of Greek literature. And so now what the Germans are doing is that they've got this guy named Goethe, and they, and it's very explicit what Schiller writes called on naive and sentimental poetry. Now, naive and sentimental are not negative terms in Schiller. There's two kinds of poets. There's the poets who write with nature, and they're the great poets because they're at one with the world. And then there's the sentimental poets who are cut off from the world and are just reflecting on the world. So they're weaker. They're kind of, they're intellectual. Yeah. And he says that Goethe, we at last have this poet who is one with nature. And what that does is it gives German literature, the German culture, this authenticity that's equal to the Greeks. And so really for the next 100 years, the Germans reject Latin literature as inferior. And there's statements such as, all Roman literature is inferior to the Greek originals. Wow. I think that's one of the most stupidest things I've ever read. But you'll see this remark repeated hundreds of times. Most recently in the Norton Book of Classical Verse. It has, doesn't even, it has. Now, I will be quite honest. I don't read Greek except to understand some Christian terms and the names of fraternities. And so my Greek is limited, but I do know Latin well, and I've read it. And I read German, I read French, I read Italian, I read English, and I've spent my life reading things. And I don't know anything better than the greatest Latin works. Wow. So you can't tell me if Virgil is inferior. I just don't get it.
Yeah, I want to be inferior with him.
If Horace is inferior, if Catullus is inferior. These are tremendous things. And that's how I feel with Seneca. I never read Seneca's things. Oh, second rate, this, that, and the other. I got I think one day of him in college, and right away I said, this guy's good.
Yeah.
And so what you had this myth of the original writers who are one with nature and the later writers who are imitators, which was now being reenacted in Germany. And Americans have just picked this up as a received idea. So most people that tell you most things in intellectual life are just repeating something they've heard. Yeah. So anyway, part of what I did in this with Seneca is I'm saying, let's actually read Seneca fairly. Yeah. And in order to do that, I would say, well, you may not like him. You don't want to read him. But actually, all Renaissance tragedy comes out of him. So if you like Lope de Vega, you like Racine, you like Corneille, you like Shakespeare, you have to account for why were they so stupid that they liked this guy.
Yeah, very well said.
Yeah, so it's an act of restoration. And what interests me is that Seneca was also has an interesting relationship to the Christian and the Catholic tradition.
Well, let me ask you this. So on that note, I'm on fire about this. I love this. I was kind of sad to be done reading the book. For the uninitiated, or for those who have read this latest release, The Madness of Hercules, what works of Seneca's are next? I mean, not the ones that you would potentially translate. What should we read next? What are the next? I know there's 10 or 7. Tell me what do you recommend?
Well, after I finished this thing, I'm the only person probably in history who's published 2 books on Seneca in the same year.
It's a renaissance. It's a renaissance.
It's not a great career move. What happened was that when I brought the Seneca thing out, I said, there's hundreds of these. Seneca was tremendous as a kind of writer of maxims. He didn't write like self-standing maxims, but he'll have a paragraph, and at the end of the paragraph he'll have a sentence or a middle paragraph that sums it up. And ever since ancient times, people have collected sayings by Seneca. And so I thought, the easiest way of approaching Seneca is just to read, 70, 80 of his best remarks. And so the Trinity Forum, which I hope your listeners know, it's in Washington, D.C., it's a forum, that's based, trying to trying to talk about the connections between faith and culture, religion and the arts. They have every form, 3 months they publish a reading, and it goes to their book groups and things like that. So I convinced Cherie Harder, who runs it, against her better judgment, to let me do Seneca, who's a pagan writer. And then once she agreed, and she said, well, didn't he, persecute Christians? I said, no, Nero did. But, this is after Seneca left Rome. I said, I told her I wanted to, when I had it, also to put the Latin. And she didn't know what to think about that. And so we brought out a little edition just called Sentences from Seneca. And I have a long introduction, then I have these remarks. And I think if you just want an easy introduction to Seneca, you could get this. And if you're an amateur Latinist, which a lot of Catholics are, you have the pleasure of having the Latin underneath it. But when you look at these, most of these, Seneca spent a lot of his time in exile. And so he wrote letters to people, and people wrote letters to him. And so he was always giving people, he was the, this is an antique allusion. He was the Dear Abby, or Anne Landers of the ancient world. People would, some guy would write him and saying, I've lost hope and or this, that, and the other. And Seneca would write these letters back. Now Seneca wrote these things very carefully because he knew that whoever got them would be reading to all their friends. And I'm sure Seneca kept copies of them. And so these are the epistles of Seneca, and there's, a great one on anger. There's some of them are consolations. So people have lost their family or were facing death, and he talks about these. And most of the quotes that I have, there's a few from the tragedies, but most of them are from, these things, and they're very, like there's this one fellow writes him, and he's just obsessed with death because all these people. Because back then, you could catch a bad. For the last two weeks, I've had this respiratory virus, and it kills some people. Even in modern age, it kills some people. Back then you could get something, you could be perfectly fine, and you could get something, and you could be dead. So this guy is obsessed with death, and so Seneca writes back. He says, "What you're telling me is death follows me and life flees." Because someone says with death you can't enjoy life. And he says, so you're asking me to teach you how to face these problems, to make you stop trying to escape death so that life doesn't escape you. And then he goes on to this one of his letters that's about, just not worrying about this since you can't control it. How do I put this? My first son died when he was a baby. It almost, just the worst thing that ever happened in my life. But as my wife and I came out of it, it took us a long time. And this is true as I sat by the deathbeds and watched my parents die. The only healthy response is to say, what a great gift life is. What a great gift other people's whom we love's lives are. And so while we have this incredible gift of sharing time and space together, enjoy it. Give yourself to it. Be generous. And I think that's what Seneca is trying to tell people in this thing, because the very basis of Stoicism is that you're going to die. You can't control it. You can't avoid it. Maybe you can live a long time. Maybe you don't. But you can't. So everything you do has to be done in the same way that Saint Jerome, who wanted to canonize Seneca, by the way, Saint Jerome, legendarily had a skull on his desk as a memento mori, and what Seneca would say is that doesn't, remembering death doesn't make you morose, doesn't make you sad. It makes you joyful.
Yes.
Excuse me, that's my cat meowing in the background. I'm looking for lunch. How did you get in? So anyway, and so I think that I think that the funny thing about Seneca is he's quite comic. He's quite amusing. Because he doesn't want to waste life.
Yes.
And there's a wonderful one. I reprinted basically a punchline of his joke. Seneca, the less possessions you have, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Romans, when they would travel, they'd have all their slaves bring all this stuff in so they could, live in luxury wherever they were. And Seneca brought like nothing, And somebody, and he says, well, I don't. He says, I don't want any difference if it gets shipwrecked. I want to, so his thing is, I was shipwrecked before I got on board.
Wow.
He lost everything.
Yes.
And he travels by. And it's just like Jesus saying, don't bring an extra pair of sandals. Yep. Don't bring this. Don't worry about food. You go forward. And I think that's why so many of the church fathers felt such an affinity with him, is that the sensible and this is the thing most people don't realize. I was at an event last night with these Catholics, and they're talking about this. I said, you don't understand. I said, Catholics are actually very joyful people. It's the reward of it is to bask in grace and joy. There's a new order of young sisters that's not far from us that my wife and I have support. And when I go there, they're just the happiest people I'll meet all year. And so I'm not saying that Seneca is Mr. Sunshine, because the tragedies are very, very unrelievedly dark. Yeah. But Seneca, essentially has liberated himself from the shadows that fell over many people's lives. And Seneca takes essentially paganism as far as you can go until the incarnation.
Great. It's on that note, and this whole conversation has been so enlightening, and in part, I think this thread that courses through it, which has to do with how does we sometimes read tragedy to cope with tragedy, and I think there is something to be said about the notion that the Catholic faith absolutely embraces the notion that there is darkness in this veil of tears. There is darkness here. It's eyes wide open. It isn't sentimental. It is absolutely the gritty grappling with what it means to suffer. But Catholics, if we're doing it right, aren't intended to stay there. That the grace outshines the suffering. And it's interesting, and I've said this, people have heard me say this too many times, but it's one of the reasons why I love George Bernanot as a French Catholic writer, because he so grapples with honest and gritty suffering, and yet grace still, as he famously ends his last lines of the book, The Diary of a Country Priest, grace is everywhere, that it outlives it. And I think that, again, to commiserate, to catharsis, to learn to celebrate joyfully the world that we have, requires us to have our eyes wide open. And what an extraordinary admission on your part, Dana, in the face of a tragedy that people can't even imagine having to go through, the death of a child, to say the only healthy response is what a great gift life is, what a great gift others' lives are. That in the midst of tragedy and suffering, we can, if we're looking with the eyes God gave us, and if we do abandon ourselves to divine providence, grace, we can see the grace that is there. It's an extraordinary thing. And as I'm hearing you pour out about Seneca, and having spent all this time writing not one but two in the last year books on Seneca, it seems that, boy, if there's a reason for writing about him and resurrecting his work, it is that reason, that to grapple with tragedy is also to rediscover grace. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, no, it is. I think it's the precondition. I mean, the Catholic Church is a religion based on a tragic myth. But unlike the tragic myths of the Greeks and Romans, this is a redemptive tragedy. By undergoing all of the pain and guilt, the scapegoating that the fallen human race does, willingly, Jesus redeems humanity. And you see this, you go to an art museum where you see the saints holding up the instruments by which they were killed triumphantly. Yeah. So saying the very instruments that the secular world or the pagan world used to humiliate and destroy them became the instruments of their eternal salvation and glory. And that is a message which changes everything about existence.
Dana Gioia, poet, critic, and translator of Seneca's The Madness of Hercules. I cannot thank you enough for taking this time. It's been a great pleasure talking with you.
Well, I'm delighted. I want to say one more thing. That
Please.
The book published by Wise Blood Books, which is this great new Catholic press, started by Joshua Wren, and they have done fabulous things. And I'm delighted to have this book of mine published by Wise Blood.
And if I can say, we also celebrate the work of Joshua Wren, and interviewed him about the state of Catholic publishing on this very podcast. So we celebrate with you. And Dana, we sure hope you're coming back on for the next book. I know you got 2 paragraphs left. So once you're done with those, and once it goes to print, give me a call and let's do this again.
Okay, it'd be my pleasure.
Thank you.
God bless.
So I've been thinking, from our very beginnings, human beings have been special. While modern biologists all too eagerly seek to lump us into the animal kingdom as slightly more advanced and slightly less hairy mammals, There is no question that there is something extraordinary, even to the hardened atheist eye, about human beings. Not only do we craft space shuttles and chemotherapies, indoor plumbing and iPhones, but we wax philosophically about truth and write poetically about love. We laugh at exuberant baby showers and pray at mournful funerals. There is something special about being human, and that is why we read tragedies. Tragedies are not written to engage us in an exercise of gratuitous sadism or self-immolating masochism. Instead, they are crafted to bring us together in community so that we may commiserate, so that we may learn indispensable lessons, and so that we may recognize that notwithstanding searing, incomprehensible loss, something important happened. Something exquisitely valuable, notwithstanding its tragic end, simply was. Seneca's tragedy, The Madness of Hercules, embodies this notion. A heroic figure is about to become a tragic one. Bent under, but ultimately victorious over, the 12 grueling labors imposed upon him by King Eurystheus, Hercules emerges from the underworld to return to his homeland and his longed-for family. Irate that Hercules did not perish and would now be immortalized as hero and god by the wayward Zeus, the spurned goddess Juno decides to destroy Hercules using the world's greatest weapon, Hercules himself. With echoes from the book of Genesis, where Satan as serpent with honey-coated tongue tempts Eve to eat the apple, insisting, "You shall be like gods," Juno craftily muddles Hercules' thinking, which leads to the slaughter of his own family by his own hand. The despair is so crushing that Hercules pines for darkest exile. Distraught over his mark as a murderer, conjures up images of the mark of Cain for murdering his brother. Distressed over his unwashable bloody hands, reminds us of Lady Macbeth's obsessive washing of similar stains from her murderous acts. But two figures step in to comfort the inconsolable Hercules. His stepfather, Amphitryon, instructs, "Let these evils pass you in silence." This effectively says that Hercules doesn't understand the entire picture of this tragedy. His acts are imponderable and will only torture him more in their deeper consideration. And Hercules' friend Theseus ushers him away on a path to where the gods win pardon for their deeds. This to let Hercules know there is redemption for even the most awful of sins. Why do we read tragedies like Seneca's The Madness of Hercules? Perhaps Dana Gioia answered it best of all. When Dana was a young father, as he told us, he and his wife experienced the devastation of losing a child. How does one grapple with this? How does one recover from this? Amphitryon, surveying the scene of his dead daughter and grandchildren, confessed, "I ask for nothing. Sorrow goes no further." But in years that have passed and only softened, but not eradicated the sorrow, Dana offered this: the only healthy response to such tragedy is to acknowledge what a great gift life is and what a great gift others' lives are. To be sure, tragedy explores suffering, but not in a gratuitous way. It grapples with searing loss so that we might be reminded by the good that once was there. The assurance that our sense of loss is truly justified is, in fact, the beginning of hope. And one last thing. Before reading The Madness of Hercules, I was only familiar with Seneca's insights and aphorisms. Now I am diving deep into Seneca's other tragedies. So this week I'm recommending, along with Wiseblood Books' The Madness of Hercules, the Trinity Forum's Sentences from Seneca, a collection of Seneca's thoughts, and the Oxford World's Classics version of 6 tragedies by Seneca. These tragedies include Phaedra and Oedipus, Medea and Thyestes, among others. Read these works for community amidst suffering, but walk away from these works with eyes wide to the graces that outlive the suffering. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner. Until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.